On the morning of February 24th, 1981, the day the engagement was officially announced, Lady Diana Spencer was handed a schedule. Not a congratulatory note, not flowers. A typed itinerary, prepared by the Queen's private secretary, detailing what her life would look like from that point forward. It specified when she would appear, where she would stand, what she would wear, in broad categorical terms, and how she would interact with the press. According to Paul Burrell, who served as Diana's butler for a decade and documented the period extensively in his memoir, A Royal Duty, Diana glanced at the schedule, set it down on the table, and asked a single question that no one in the room expected. She asked where the children would be. Not her own children, she had none yet. She meant the children at the public engagements. She wanted to know if she would be meeting any. The courtiers exchanged looks. The schedule did not account for that kind of question. It accounted for timing, protocol, curtsies, and the correct angle at which to hold a handbag. It did not account for someone who wanted to touch the people she was being sent to wave at. That distinction between waving and touching would define the next 16 years of the British monarchy. Diana Frances Spencer was 19 years old when she entered the royal household, and the assumption among those who managed the institution was that youth would make her pliable. She came from aristocratic stock. The Spencer family had served the crown for generations, and her father, the 8th Earl Spencer, had been equerry to both King George VI and Queen Elizabeth II. She had grown up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, literally within sight of the royal residence. She was not, by any measure, an outsider. And yet from the first week inside Buckingham Palace, it became clear that familiarity with the institution was not the same as submission to it. The royal family in 1981 operated on a set of unwritten codes that had calcified over decades. Public engagements were managed performances, tightly timed, closely choreographed, with minimal physical contact between royals and the public. The monarch did not hug. The monarch did not crouch. The monarch certainly did not sit on hospital beds. These were not suggestions. They were the architecture of distance that the House of Windsor had built since the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII's emotional impulsiveness nearly destroyed the institution. Elizabeth II had spent her entire reign reinforcing that architecture. Duty was performed with composure, warmth was expressed through formality, and affection was something you kept behind closed doors. This was the world Diana entered. And within months, she began dismantling it, not with rebellion, but with instinct. Her first solo public engagement came on October 28, 1981, 3 months after the wedding. She was sent to switch on the Christmas lights at Regent Street in London. The palace had selected the event deliberately. It was minor, festive, and carried no diplomatic weight. A safe debut. What the planners had not anticipated was the crowd. Thousands of people turned out, pressing against the barriers, calling her name. According to Dickie Arbiter, who served as the palace press secretary and later described the scene in his book On Duty with the Queen, Diana walked the line slowly, far more slowly than protocol dictated. She stopped repeatedly. She shook hands without gloves, a small detail that violated established practice, since gloves served as both a hygiene measure and a physical barrier. When a woman in the crowd began crying, Diana reached through the barrier and held her hand for nearly 30 seconds. The press captured it. The photograph ran on every front page the next morning. Inside the palace, the reaction was not celebration. It was concern. A royal who lingered created security complications and scheduling chaos. But the public had already decided what it wanted, and what it wanted was the woman who stopped. In March 1982, during a tour of Wales, Diana visited a hospice in the Rhondda Valley. She had been briefed beforehand by her lady-in-waiting, Anne Beckwith-Smith, on the expected routine: walk through, meet the director, shake hands with selected staff, depart within 20 minutes. Diana followed the route as planned until she reached the ward. There she sat down on the edge of a patient's bed. The patient was an elderly man in the final stages of lung disease. She took his hand, leaned close, and spoke to him quietly for several minutes. The ward staff stood in silence. Beckwith-Smith, according to her own later account given to biographer Andrew Morton for Diana, Her True Story, was unsure whether to intervene. No royal had ever sat on a patient's bed during an official visit. The implied intimacy of it crossed a line that the institution considered fundamental. When Diana stood up, the man was in tears. So were two of the nurses. The footage was not initially released by the palace, but a local camera crew had captured it. When it aired that evening, the switchboard at Buckingham Palace received more calls than it had after the engagement announcement. The hospice later reported a 400% increase in volunteer applications in the following month. Diana had discovered, accidentally or otherwise, that proximity was more powerful than pageantry. During the royal tour of Australia and New Zealand in March and April 1983, Diana broke protocol in a way that initially seemed minor but carried enormous symbolic weight. She insisted on bringing 9-month-old Prince William. Previous royal tours had always followed the same rule. Children stayed home with nannies, and parents fulfilled their obligations abroad. The Queen herself had left a young Charles for months at a time during Commonwealth tours in the 1950s. It was simply how things were done. According to journalist Robert Lacey, writing in Battle of Brothers, the decision to bring William was made after a tense exchange between Diana and the Queen's private secretary, Sir William Heseltine. Heseltine argued tradition, Diana argued motherhood. Charles, caught between his wife and the institution, sided with Diana, one of the few early occasions on which he did so publicly. The Australian press embraced it immediately. Photographs of Diana holding William at a photo call in the gardens of Government House in Auckland became defining images of the tour. The crowds in Australia were unprecedented. Over 1 million people lined the streets of Sydney alone. Charles, walking the opposite side of the road, heard the groans of disappointment when people realised they had been assigned his side rather than hers. According to Jonathan Dimbleby, Charles's authorised biographer, the prince described the experience to friends as demoralising. Diana had not merely bent a rule. She had demonstrated that the public's emotional loyalty could be redirected by a single gesture of warmth. In November 1983, Diana attended a gala dinner at the Royal Opera House. The dress code specified formal evening wear, and the palace had coordinated her outfit with the dresser assigned to her. She was expected to wear a high-necked gown in keeping with the conservative preferences of the Queen. Instead, she arrived in a strapless black taffeta gown designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, the same designers who had made her wedding dress. The dress was striking, deliberately modern, and showed far more skin than any senior royal woman had displayed at an official evening event in living memory. According to Elizabeth Emanuel, interviewed years later by Vanity Fair in 2017, Diana had chosen the dress herself and told the designers she wanted something that would make people sit up. The reaction inside the family was swift. The Queen reportedly said nothing directly to Diana, but communicated her disapproval through a lady-in-waiting. Prince Philip was more direct. Burrell later recounted that Philip made a remark about knowing the difference between a nightclub and an opera house. The tabloids, however, were rapturous. Diana was on every cover the next day. She had learned something the palace had not yet grasped, that in the age of mass media, the image was the message, and she was exceptionally fluent in images. By the mid-1980s, the pattern was established, and the palace had begun to adapt, or rather, to manage the consequences. But the most significant rule-breaking was still ahead. In April 1987, Diana opened the United Kingdom's first purpose-built ward for AIDS patients at the London Middlesex Hospital. The disease was at its peak of public terror. Misinformation was rampant. A substantial portion of the British public believed, incorrectly, that HIV could be transmitted through casual contact. The government's own public health campaign, launched in 1986, had featured tombstones and the slogan, "Don't die of ignorance," which many critics argued had increased fear rather than understanding. Diana was advised by palace officials not to attend. The risk, they argued, was not medical but reputational. Association with AIDS carried a stigma that could tarnish the crown. Diana attended anyway, and in front of the assembled cameras, she shook the hand of an AIDS patient without wearing gloves. The gesture was calculated and precise. She knew the cameras were rolling. She knew what the absence of gloves would communicate. According to the ward's head nurse, interviewed by the BBC in 2017, the patient, a young man named Ivan, began crying when she touched him. He told the nurse afterwards that Diana was the first person outside the medical staff who had touched him in weeks. The photograph was transmitted globally within hours. It did more to shift public perception of AIDS than any government campaign that year. Jeff Hurst, then chairman of the Terence Higgins Trust, said publicly that Diana's handshake did more to counter stigma in a single afternoon than we had managed in 5 years of advocacy. In January 1989, Diana visited a shelter for homeless families in London's East End, an engagement that had not appeared on the official palace schedule. She had arranged it privately through her own office, bypassing the standard coordination process that routed all royal engagements through the Queen's household. According to Patrick Jeffson, Diana's private secretary from 1988 to 1996, who documented the period extensively in Shadows of a Princess, the visit was deliberately unannounced to prevent the palace from vetoing it. Homelessness was considered a politically sensitive topic, and the convention was that royals avoided any engagement that could be interpreted as commentary on government policy. Diana spent 3 hours at the shelter, sitting on the floor with children, speaking at length with mothers about their circumstances. She asked specific questions about housing policy that, Jeffson noted, surprised even her own staff with their detail. When the visit became public, through press photographs taken as she departed, Buckingham Palace issued a statement noting that it had been a private engagement. The phrasing was deliberate. It distanced the institution from Diana's action, while acknowledging it had happened. Diana, according to Jeffson, found the palace's discomfort amusing. She told him in the car afterward, "They're worried I'll make people think the Queen doesn't care about homeless children. But the Queen doesn't visit homeless children." In September 1991, Diana attended a Relate marriage counselling centre in Birmingham, an engagement that carried a different kind of tension. By that point, her marriage to Charles was widely understood to be in serious difficulty, though no official acknowledgement had been made. The visit to a counselling centre was, at minimum, optically provocative. According to Andrew Morton, who was by then in direct, secret communication with Diana for his forthcoming biography, Diana chose the engagement deliberately. She wanted the symbolism to be visible. During the visit, she sat in on a group session, with the consent of the participants, and asked the counsellor a question that several journalists in the press pool overheard. She asked what happened when one person in a marriage wants to be honest and the other wants to keep pretending. The counsellor answered diplomatically. Diana nodded. The exchange was reported in the following day's newspapers. Buckingham Palace declined to comment. Within Charles's office at St. James's Palace, the reaction was described by Dimbleby as cold fury. The visit was seen not merely as a breach of protocol, but as a strategic public maneuver, Diana using the machinery of royal engagement to communicate personal grievances. Whether that interpretation was fair depends on where you stand. What is not in dispute is that she understood exactly what the optics would convey. In June 1992, Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story was published. The book contained extraordinary detail about the marriage's collapse, Diana's struggles with bulimia, her self-harm, and her isolation within the royal household. What was not publicly known at the time, but was confirmed after Diana's death, was that Diana herself had secretly provided Morton with hours of recorded testimony, smuggled out of Kensington Palace on audio cassettes carried by her friend James Colthurst. The palace initially dismissed the book as tabloid speculation. Diana herself issued a public denial of cooperation, which was technically true in the narrowest sense. She had not met Morton in person. But the recordings told the full story, and Morton had built the book around them. The publication shattered the remaining pretense of marital harmony. It also represented a fundamental inversion of the royal communication model. For decades, the palace had controlled the narrative. All information flowed outward through official channels. Diana had bypassed the entire system and spoken directly to the public through a chosen intermediary. According to Jeffson, the Queen's response was a single sentence delivered to her private secretary. She has made her decision. The chill in those words captured the full weight of the institution's judgment. In December 1993, Diana announced her withdrawal from public life, a decision that lasted barely a year before she re-emerged on her own terms, stripped of the palace's oversight. And in November 1995, she gave the interview. Her appearance on the BBC's Panorama, conducted by Martin Bashir, was watched by nearly 23 million viewers. She had arranged it without the knowledge of the palace, her own private secretary, or the Queen. According to Jeffson, he learned about it from the newspapers. In the interview, Diana spoke with startling directness. She acknowledged her affair with James Hewitt. She questioned Charles's fitness to be king, and she delivered the line that defined the entire narrative. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The broadcast broke every rule the institution held sacred: discretion, loyalty, the primacy of the crown over individual feeling. Within a month, the Queen wrote personally to both Charles and Diana, advising them to divorce. The letter, confirmed by multiple sources including Burrell, was unprecedented. Elizabeth II had never before directly intervened in a family member's marriage in writing. The Panorama interview was the logical endpoint of what had begun on that first morning with the typed schedule. Diana had been told how the system worked. She had understood it perfectly, and she had decided from almost the very beginning that she would not comply. What emerges from the documented record is not a simple story of rebellion. Diana did not reject the rules because she did not understand them. She rejected them because she understood something the institution did not: that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to be felt, not merely observed. The rules she was handed on that first day were designed for a world of managed distance, where the Crown's authority derived from its separateness. Diana grasped, intuitively and then strategically, that the age of television had changed the contract. The public no longer wanted to admire the royal family from across a barrier. They wanted to feel connected to it, and connection required vulnerability, physical warmth, emotional honesty, everything the palace had spent decades suppressing. Her methods were not always clean. The Morton book involved deception. The Panorama interview, as later investigations revealed, was obtained through Bashir's fraudulent use of forged bank statements to win Diana's trust, a scandal that took 25 years to fully surface and resulted in a 2021 inquiry led by Lord Dyson that condemned the BBC's conduct. Diana's own role was complex. She used the press as a weapon when it suited her and complained bitterly when it turned against her. She craved control over her image while presenting herself as someone who had none. These contradictions do not diminish what she accomplished. They make it human. The rules she broke were real rules, maintained for real reasons. The institution's caution was not mere stuffiness. It was a survival strategy developed after the abdication, refined over decades, and designed to prevent exactly the kind of emotional chaos that Diana's presence introduced. But the institution's caution was also, by the 1980s, becoming its weakness. The monarchy risked irrelevance through rigidity. Diana, by accident, instinct, and eventually design, forced it to change. If this kind of account interests you, the documented detail behind the public image, the specific moments where the official story and the private reality diverge, subscribing to the channel means you will see more of them. It costs nothing. The bell notification ensures the next one reaches you when it goes up. There are more stories in this vein already in progress, and the evidence behind them is just as specific. The schedule that was placed in front of Diana Spencer on the morning of February the 24th, 1981, still exists in principle, if not in physical form. Its assumptions that a young woman from an aristocratic family would absorb the institution's codes, perform her role with disciplined composure, and subordinate her instincts to the collective image of the crown were not unreasonable. They had worked for generations. Every consort, every spouse, every family member who entered the system had eventually adapted. The schedule assumed Diana would do the same. It did not account for someone who would pick it up, set it down, and ask about the children. That question, where are the children, was not a rejection of the rules. It was a redefinition of what the rules were for. Diana understood, from that very first morning, that the institution existed to serve the public, not itself. And she understood that service meant presence, real, physical, emotional presence, not performance. The palace learned that lesson. It took them 16 years and a funeral watched by 2.5 billion people, but they learned it. The walkabouts are longer now. The handshakes happen without gloves. The hospital visits include sitting on beds. The monarchy that Diana entered in 1981 no longer exists. The one that replaced it carries her fingerprints on every visible surface. She was told the rules on her first day. She understood them completely. And then she did what she believed was right instead.